Well, today on Spotlight Now, we focus on two guests who are laser focused on the efforts on Maui. We first start off with our first guest, who's going to be updating us on all things that are happening in Washington, D.C., and that's with Representative Ed Case.
Yeah, following that, we'll be speaking with Tyler Iokepa Gomes of CNHA. They just wrapped up their conference on Maui. We'll be talking about sustainable tourism and future plans for Lahaina. Spotlight Now starts now.
You're watching Spotlight Now with Ryan Kalei-Suji and Yunji Denise on Hawaii News Now. Have questions or comments for our guests? Join the conversation in our Facebook live stream. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
And joining us now live here in the studio is Congressman Ed Case. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you in person.
Aloha. It's good to see you in person, too. I'm glad to get out of Washington, D.C. for the week.
You know, there is a lot of things that we want to get to, as we mentioned at the top of the show, of course, talking about some of the efforts that are happening on Maui and what you are doing specifically to help with some of the funding and just the recovery efforts. But we want to talk about some of the news that's breaking about Red Hill and a $1.2 billion claim that the Board of Water Supply is citing with the Navy and some of the overall costs that it has cost the Board of Water Supply to deal with the issue of Red Hill. We know that you have been working on this issue for quite some time now. Your thoughts about overall, not only this cost and this suit, but just how to navigate through this, knowing that this could be a price tag that continues to climb.
Well, let's start with some good news, which is that Red Hill is well on its way to being defueled and to being closed. And that's a major accomplishment. We're now down to almost 100% of the fuel in the tanks being drained out and disposed of somewhere else. We've got a couple more months to get to the harder to get to fuel, but the bottom line is it is almost empty now, and we're on the process of closing it. There are a whole bunch of issues that are going to go on for years, and we've said this all along. This is a years-long process. Number one, actual damages to the city, to the state, to others from the consequences of the leaks. Number two, tracking long-term health care consequences, which is something very topical. I was just talking with Senator Schatz about an initiative that we have in Congress right now that we're trying to get passed for a long-term registry. And then, of course, Ernie Lau did let us know yesterday, as a matter of courtesy, that he was filing this claim. And let's face it, there are consequences that are in the billions of dollars that the Navy and the federal government need to take care of. And so whether that comes as a result of a judicial process, which is what he has initiated, or because of congressional action, which is what we've initiated, or any other way, we've got a ways to go still.
Do you think that this was the appropriate mechanism to try to recoup some of those costs?
Well, it was one of the mechanisms, and the Board of Water Supply was legally under time constraints to actually bring that claim. So they had to bring it or they were going to lose it. So I have no objections to them pursuing it. It's not technically a lawsuit yet. The process is under the Federal Tort Claims Act, is to file a claim. The federal government, in this case, the Department of Defense, has 6 months to see if they can work it out. If they can't during that period of time, then an actual lawsuit is brought against the federal government by the Board of Water Supply. So the next 6 months is critical. Again, we have to pursue all alternatives to be made whole from this, whether it be the costs of new wells, which is primarily what this claim is about, or tracking whatever remaining leakage there is into the aquifer. And this has to be a long-term process to make sure that there are no long-term consequences.
In those conversations that you've had thus far surrounding Red Hill over the last few years, essentially, what has been the climate or the pulse that you've gotten from some of your colleagues that maybe you've had to educate about this? Do they see this as an issue? And how much educating are you having to do to convince your colleagues in Washington, D.C. of the importance of this to really help continuing the funding and support that we've seen over the years?
We have done a lot of educating. I've brought colleagues out here personally. I've walked through Red Hill with them. These are colleagues on my appropriations committee that has to fund all of these efforts. These are colleagues on the Armed Services Committee that has to authorize the actions of our federal government to defuel and close Red Hill. And so you bring every tool in your toolkit to a large and critical issue like this. In the very beginning, when this first broke, we were almost completed for the fiscal year. And at that point, it was simply a matter of having relationships with colleagues that just took it on trust that the initial actions by the federal government to fund the recovery at $1 billion plus needed to be in a last minute bill that you don't get much in there. So that was not about educating. That was just about them trusting that us when we said we really, really need this right now. After that, for the midterm and long term, it was a little bit more educational. But frankly, every colleague that came out here took the time to walk through Red Hill, took the time to understand what we were facing, took the time to reflect on the fact that Red Hill is over our principal aquifer. I never had one that didn't understand at the end of the day that they needed to support us. So the support has been really rock solid, and it's been on both sides of the aisle, by the way. You got to do that.
I'm interested to learn more about this registry that you and the senator are working on. But before that, just so that I understand, I mean, whether it's through the actions that you're pursuing or the action now that Ernie Lau is pursuing, bottom line, do you think that the federal government, as opposed to the ratepayers here, should be covering this cost?
I think the federal government should be covering the costs that are associated with the leakage, period. And so, the federal government shouldn't be covering costs that would have come up anyway. But where we have significant risks to the aquifer that were caused by the Navy, where we had to take action to address those risks, obviously exploratory wells. Ernie wants to drill completely new wells to assure the water supply and not be so at risk from any residual Red Hill threat. He's right to do that. That was caused by Red Hills, so yes. Where there's a cause and effect, the federal government should be responsible.
And let's get to that registry and hearing a little bit about that.
Well, we know that there are, of course, healthcare consequences to folks that were exposed to the leakage itself. So they drank it. In some cases, they were simply exposed to it other than drinking it. What we don't know, because it's really never been studied over the long term, is whether there are any long-term effects. Now, people that were sick, some still think they are sick, but we're not talking about just 1, 2, 3 years. We're talking about 5 to 10 years. And so there's a necessity to try to track them over time, because remember that these are largely military families. They're not going to be here. In fact, most of them that were exposed are not here anymore. They're off in some base somewhere else, or they're out of the service. And so what's critical for us, and this includes the civilians as well, because we move as well. What's critical is to develop a common registry that all people who felt that they might have been exposed are tracked systematically over time. So we're talking 5 to 10 years. So if or longer. So if a consequence shows up that maybe somebody forgot that it might have been Red Hill, they can say, oh, well, what about that? Maybe that was a cause. Maybe that is why we should treat for toxic exposure. And so this is an initiative that Senator Schatz is, he deserves the credit for getting it going. I'm his partner in the House. We're trying to get it passed.
Again, we want to encourage all of you who may be watching that have questions directly for Congressman Case. You can always put it into our Facebook comment section, or you can scan this QR code that you see at the bottom, enter your questions, and we'll try to get through and monitor them as they continue to come on in this discussion. Just last week we talked to Vice Admiral Wade about the future plans of Red Hill and this transition in leadership and overall what's happening there. They discussed what the future of this facility looks like and the complete shutdown and closure. They're still going out there and getting community responses and really trying to gauge what the community feels. Have you had any other conversations with constituents? What have you heard about what people generally think this facility, what should become of this facility, or if anything should become of it?
Well, I've had those conversations right from the beginning because, of course, in the beginning it was just a crisis. You had to respond to it. And then in the midterm, you had to get the Department of Defense to understand that it needed to be defueled and closed. Once we got past the kind of defueling and closing, then, thoughts turned to, well, okay, if we're going to close it, what do we do with it next? I have studiously tried to stay very, very focused on the federal government's responsibilities to defuel and close, and not really engage a whole bunch in, what do we do with it next? I'm just trying to get through the steps of getting it defueled, getting the closure done, and then we can kind of take that on. I obviously have thoughts about it, and I obviously do hear from my constituents and others about what the next steps are. I think it's going to be a long process, first of all. So anybody that thinks that just because we close it, we automatically convert over to some other, use. No, that's not going to happen. I think the most likely outcome is that once the closure occurs, it's just going to be mothballed for some significant period of time while we figure out whether there is another use for it. My own view of it, frankly, is that there probably isn't another use for it. At least a practical use that can be implemented with not huge expenditures of money. So I think we're probably going to end up with the retire in place scenario. But this discussion has to continue.
One of the other major discussions that's happening in our state is what's happened on Maui. Tell us a little bit about your efforts there. We know that there are so many people who are still hurting, especially when it comes to housing. What kind of conversations have you been having just about federal aid to that community?
Sure. Well, that is very topical too, because we're right in the middle of an appropriations cycle right now. All of these amounts have to be funded. We are not in what we call regular order, meaning that unfortunately because of too much dysfunction and polarization in Congress, we're not kind of moving in an orderly fashion through the appropriations process. We're in continuing resolutions, which are kind of like keep the funding where it is going forward. And so the money that we have needed, and I have been, just like Red Hill, everybody has their kuleana. And my kuleana together with the congressional delegation is, what are the federal government's responsibilities? What are the opportunities for the federal government to help? And how do we fund those responsibilities and opportunities? So, there's lots of decisions to be made. What Lahaina looks like in its next chapters. How do you actually massage the housing codes on Maui to provide this kind of housing? Those are primarily at the state and the county level. So of course I'm involved in them, but my focus is in Washington, D.C. on the feds. And since this incredible tragedy, there have been basically, three areas of effort. Number one, I would say just the sheer disaster, recovery. So the reaction, the stabilization, the environmental cleanup, helping people with through a very, very difficult time, identification of lost ones. And that is going along pretty well. Housing, we can come back to that because that is, to me, the number one challenge. And then finally, economic regeneration, which is how do you help businesses that were lost? How do you help them to recover? What is the Lahaina, the West Maui economy look like in its next chapters? Because it's going through a real change. We have worked, first of all, primarily with the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is responsible for federal disaster recovery relief every single day for the last 100 plus days at this point. And they're our primary go-to agency. So the first thing that we did, and we being our congressional delegation, we funded $16 billion into a short-term spending bill to replenish the disaster relief nationwide, knowing that a lot of that was going to be destined for Maui. That was number one. And so we got that done. So FEMA has the money to proceed with what it needs to be doing, and it's got a broad range of efforts that it can pursue. On the housing, FEMA's got a real issue because, as we all know in spades, housing is not particularly available. But FEMA has many options that it's pursuing. It does want to get the 6,700 or so folks that still are houseless out of those hotel rooms into intermediate housing. That's rental housing. That is in some cases, actually, renting an entire, condo building or housing project and then, releasing it out to the folks that need help. In some cases, it could include actually building buildings and or buying buildings to be dedicated to taking care of housing recovery. So it's I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a real problem. It's a real issue. It involves all of the federal government, the state government, the local government, the community to get this done right. It's not going to be easy. The real crunch time is coming where people really need to be moving out of that transitional into more permanent housing. The feds have a piece of that, and that's what I'm trying to help with. The final is economic recovery, which is a tougher nut. Because many of the federal programs don't exactly match what we need. So think about what we did during COVID, some of those programs, that helped out small businesses. A lot of the times, those don't really apply anymore because those small businesses are gone. They have no assets. They have nothing to loan against. They don't want to borrow any more money. And so can we fashion better federal programs or fund programs that are a little bit more arcane, not particularly used? Can we mix and match and mold to what Lahaina actually needs from an economic recovery? This is an area that I think ultimately the feds can take pretty good care of disaster recovery, debris removal. They can take pretty good care with partners of housing. The economic side is a little tougher, and that's where I think we're going to need a lot more step up participation by the state, by the county, by some of the NGOs and nonprofits who have a significant amount of resources to help out.
Yeah, I want to kind of get into that because when you're looking at the long term, and everybody's talking about how long this effort will take, and a lot of what you said will really focuses on the demand right now. However, when you're looking at those long-term goals and some of those things that the state will not be able to fund all on its own, how do you envision the federal government support? Is this something where you're going to have to go back year in and year out to just continue to ask for more money and try to find different mechanisms every year, essentially, in each budget cycle in order to continue these efforts moving forward?
The answer is yes. The general federal appropriation cycle is a one-year cycle, so you don't fund long-term. You've got to go back and do it all over again. And to complicate matters, not only do you have to go back and do it all over again, but you encounter different Congresses as you go along, different situations. You also have different needs. So it may be that this year you want to use this program and plus that up, as we say. So in other words, add money to it. And it may be that in another year you need to switch over to this program. And so this is from a Maui perspective. This is not going to be done for years, but it's not going to be done for years on the congressional perspective. In fact, our congressional delegation, just to give you a sense of this, the four of us put together all of our thoughts on what is collectively needed across the federal government right now. For some form of relief that could be applied to Maui in some way, shape, or form. I forget what our letter was, but it went to 16 plus pages. And this was in connection with the supplemental appropriations, which is what we're facing right now, which is the over and above the regular appropriation process. So we were telling our colleagues and the federal government, look, this is the universe. I think our universe added up to $9 billion. And it was, to give you some sense of the complexity of it, in a normal year, you will fund in 12 separate appropriations bills, which cover the entirety of the federal government. So our letter covered 9 of those 12. So in other words, we're looking right across the government. We're in the Department of Agriculture, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, obviously the Department of Homeland Security, which is FEMA. So this is going to be a group effort by your delegation for as long as this goes.
Tell us a little bit about that group dynamic. I'm interested to know, what it's like, how the four of you align your priorities, how often you meet, and how you all stay on the same page. Because given the size of our delegation, we need all of you to be working together all at once.
That's been really critical. We have, I've really been happy with my delegation for all of. I'm finishing my 5th year. Senators Hirono and Schatz have been constants throughout that, and I'm on my 3rd partner on the House side. But in each case, the delegation has always worked very well together on matters of concern. The way we really do this is, look, first of all, we're all different people. We all have our different, spheres in Congress, and that's a good thing that we all have different, connections and relationships and things that we do. So that when a crisis happens, we kind of sit around and say, well, who takes that person? Who takes that person? Sometimes, and so you try to do this. We try to maximize the 4 of us. Generally, the way we work is that we make our own decisions on national and international issues. We disagree on those issues, but when it comes to Hawaii specific, we try very, very hard, and it's not a real effort because generally it's pretty clear what we have to do. So we did this with COVID. We were completely on the same page on that. We did it with Red Hill for sure, and we're doing it with Maui. And so we talk to each other frequently. We compare notes all the time through our staffs. We do meet, regularly to just make sure that we're all on the same page personally. We all obviously have different committees. Senator Schatz and I are on appropriations, so that's a great one to punch, because we can just like conspire across, we can like, and you take a issue like Red Hill, we've had Senator Hirono on armed services, and all of my partners have been on armed services. And so that was a winner for Red Hill. So it's a good question that people don't really focus on, but we would not have been able to do what we did in COVID, Red Hill, or now with Maui if we didn't have a tight delegation.
We've been talking about some of these local disasters that have happened that has resulted in the need for these federal supports. But when you look at as a whole, and some of the things that are in front of, this Congress, when you're talking about worldwide issues and funding for, what's happening in Israel, in Ukraine, how does, in your standpoint, in trying to represent the voice of Hawaii, and you're having to manage and negotiate with all these other interests that are happening globally, how do you continue to put Hawaii at the forefront to make sure that that is a priority when there clearly are other things? And you mentioned about some of the appropriation bills that you're currently working on. How do you navigate that?
Well, I always say I have three responsibilities in Congress. My first responsibility, which is a constitutional responsibility, is a national leadership responsibility, right? So I'm one vote in the United States Congress for what our country should do, domestically and internationally, and I have to do the best I can on that, and I can never leave that behind. I have to make those tough decisions on Israel and Ukraine and, domestic issues and China and, et cetera, et cetera. My next kind of bucket is Hawaii. How do I help Hawaii? And my third bucket is how I help my individual constituents, which is an often overlooked part of my job, but it's really critical, especially if you're a constituent that is not getting your veterans benefits and you don't know why. So every single day I'm in all three of those buckets, and my staff is too. And I can't afford to do one to the exclusion of the other. In terms of the national leadership, of course I'm thinking about what Hawaii thinks. I'm also thinking about the overall dynamic, and I'm applying my own judgment to what I think we should do. That's my job. And so I've got to be pumping in all three areas all the time.
I'm interested to hear about, you mentioned the constituents and people coming to you with individual concerns. It's always an interesting thing to ask a representative what they're hearing from their constituents. During COVID, it was a lot of business owners needing small business loans and also a lot of concerns about health. What are you hearing now? What are people coming to you with?
Well, it's a good question, because I try very hard to stay in touch with what my constituents are thinking. And one of the things that I do is every once in a while I'll actually send a survey out to my constituents, and I'll ask them a number of questions. One is an open-ended question, which is, what's most bothering you? And then I ask a couple of very specific questions, which are areas that I have to deal with in Congress, and I just want to do a gut check on what my constituents think. Am I on the same page? Am I not? What do I need to consider that perhaps I haven't? And so I just sent that out last week. And then frankly, of late, I've been actually asking for a report card, which is, you kind of hold yourself and go, oh God, do I really want to get the report card? But I did ask the report card this time around. But the open-ended question to my constituents, number one was inflation and the cost of living. Number two was crime and public safety. So these are obviously, issues that you live with every single day. And inflation is still very tough. The cost of living is still very tough. And so that's got to be top of my mind in terms of what I can do at the federal level to continue to try to help bring inflation down. Now it is down. It's down to about 3%, which is about where it was pre-COVID. But that's after it went up for a couple of years. So you take something like food, which is their number one concern. My family's number one concern also. I mean, that's up 25, 30% in a very short period of time. Housing, household goods. I think we all understand that. So what can I do at the federal level for that? And then, of course, crime and public safety, even though, by national statistics, we still have relatively low crime here. That's not how people perceive it. In fact, there have actually been surveys asking, what about the gap between perception and actuality? And we have one of the broadest gaps. So obviously people are concerned about this. We've had violent crime happening. We've had very terrible crime, And so how can I make sure that the federal government is contributing to what is essentially a state and local issue? Because crime is usually left to the state and local governments. So how can I fund those programs? How can I have solid national laws that will protect people in their homes? So those are the two top issues. And then after that, it's, climate change, some of the international issues that we already talked about.
There are so many issues that, you're dealing with locally as well as nationally, and yet a lot of the conversation and headlines that we see coming out of Congress are very political. Of course, the length of time it took for a new Speaker of the House to be named. How would you describe, in your experience, what the temperature and climate is like right now in Washington, D.C.? And as somebody who has had to navigate your way through bipartisan efforts, what is your overall assessment of where things are at with this Congress?
Where things are at is very, very messy, very, very difficult. This is I don't know, I'm finishing up 9 years in Congress, and I'm sure that each one of those years, as I look back, had its difficulties. But systematically, just the mood, the difficulty in getting a consistent rhythm in Congress, whether it's a majority, minority, and I've had half-half, right? So you've got to work both ways. You don't know what the next Congress is going to bring, but it's very fluid. There are clearly extremes, and I will say in both parties, that represent minorities, minority views in the country. But because of the way that we are operating, especially on the Republican side, have a lot of sway over what's going on, and that creates a problem for the rest of us that just want to get things done. And so, on the one level, everything you see on TV is true. I mean, the 3-week speaker thing, which was a result of the majority party, the Republicans, having what amounted to a civil war, without wanting any help from us. I would have voted for the right Republican speaker under the right circumstances to help, kind of a more mainstream leadership rather than what is a very, very conservative speaker right now. I would have done that, but that wasn't an opportunity that I had because they wanted to solve it inside their own caucus. But I will also say that there's a lot that goes on in Congress under the radar of the national spotlight. That is quite bipartisan, quite constructive, and I work in that space. I'm a vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a very unique caucus of 64 members of the House, evenly divided by rules, and we try to work through things like debt ceilings. We were in the middle of the debt ceiling and the 2 continuing resolutions that were just passed. And I'll give you a very quick one because we're coming short on time. We just passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee that I'm on, the Compact of Free Association Renewal. This is an agreement we have with 3 countries, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, under which their citizens get to live in our state. And these are our compact friends and neighbors who are here right now. But taking care of them, because the federal government has declined to take care of them, has cost this state hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade or so, and that's unfair. So we, again, the delegation, Senator Hirono and I primarily, basically said, hey, feds, it's time for you to take care of this is a federal issue. You should take care of these folks. We got that out of we're advancing this right now. That could not have happened if I didn't have relationships and worked together with my Republican colleagues who are in the majority right now and who made the decision whether to advance it or not. So there's a whole level. You can't just sit up there and just live in this national polarized level. Of course you're going to have disagreements and debate and decisions, and they're going to be polarizing. We have a number of them right now. But underneath that, you got to look for opportunities to get things done, and those opportunities are there.
You're right. The time does fly by. We're almost at the halfway point. I just want to, ask you for a final thought. We are heading into Thanksgiving. What's your message to constituents? And as a side note, what's something that you do when you're home? How do you reconnect with Hawaii while you're here?
I wrote about this in my newsletter last week, and basically what I said was, with so much tragedy and strife and polarization in our world, sometimes you can get really, really discouraged. And I do, like anybody else. But I think Thanksgiving is a time to step back and reflect on a lot of things that are really good, in our world, in our country, in our Hawaii. And so that's my message: is let's all not get so caught up in the problem side of our world, and let's reflect on what is good and what we have that is good. And I think that's really critical. When I get home, first of all, I just love being at home, especially after 10 weeks of a mess in Washington, D.C. I love to spend time with my wife. We've got two very young granddaughters, and the younger one, the 2-year-old, her parents and older sister are out of town this week. So the younger one is spending alone time with the two of us, and I'm loving that.
Wonderful. Well, happy Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be right back. You're watching Spotlight Now.